In the last episode, we discussed the different climate zones of tidally locked worlds, and explored the first freshwater ecosystems, as well as the first multicellular organism to come onto land. Today, we return to the oceans to discuss how life has specialized to live in the darkest depths of the Nuskuan ecosystem. Nusku is already pretty dark in comparison to Earth, with much less luminosity, and with much of it being in the infrared spectrum. Infrared light gets absorbed by water much faster than what we call visible light, so deeper water will experience less infrared light than shallower water. So while organisms living closer to the surface will have more red-shifted sight, organisms in deeper water may have sight closer to the range that we see in, as it is advantageous for organisms to see the type of light that exists in their habitat. In addition, living on such a dark planet means that seeing may not always be the best way to sense their environment. So some of our creatures may have evolved different methods of finding their way around. Sensory hardware outside of sight may have evolved as early as the species Lamina. They may have specialized cells called chemoreceptors that detect chemical signatures. These creatures may have evolved them to help detect gametes from other individuals of their own species, prompting them to release their own gametes. This will greatly improve their reproductive efficiency and will grant their descendants a powerful weapon. The Catobranchis were the first creatures that evolved eyes, but they may have evolved other senses as well. The bulbous structures that their eyes are attached to may be covered in chemoreceptors. This adaptation may allow them to detect clouds of microscopic prey when they are unable to see them, essentially acting like both a sense of taste and a sense of smell. The Trilomorphs may further specialize this adaptation, specializing some chemoreceptors for smell and some chemoreceptors for taste. Having the scent ones near the front of the feeding arms will allow members of this group to wave their arms through the water to pick up the scent of prey items. Having the taste-adapted ones near the middle and base of the feeding arms will allow this creature to taste prey in the grasp of their feeding arms before swallowing. Later on, when the Loricatrum stoma evolve, they may improve their chemoreceptors in much the same way as the Trilomorphs, but they may gain another adaptation to help them hunt their prey. On Earth, aquatic vertebrates have evolved a lateral line system that allows them to detect changes in water pressure and the movement of nearby objects. The Loricatrum stoma may evolve something similar, although these organisms may evolve a set of sensory rings that essentially achieve the same purpose. These rings may be present in the indents between the plates of the exoskeleton. This new shape means that we cannot call it the lateral line system, so instead, I've coined the extremely creative name of the lateral ring system. This sensory hardware will make these predators extremely effective at hunting their small prey. It will help their larger cousins too, helping them track prey in darker areas. The Podylamina have eyes for sight and vibration-sensitive hairs that function similar to hearing. The Podylamina may have internalized their chemoreceptors into the respiration pores, so when water is moved past them through breathing, the chemoreceptors can pick up faint chemical signatures in the water. Their chemoreceptors will lose their reproductive function at this time and become mainly used for scent. The Ostopecies may have evolved a very similar location for their chemoreceptors, placing them within their first two breathing pores, gaining an ability to smell similar to the Podylamina. Some of the more derived groups may also have evolved another lateral line system. Some members of the Diorostroclade may have it, as well as the Acutomorphs and the Tyrannoposauri that evolved from them. These organisms' lateral line system may be more alike to vertebrates on Earth, lining the sides and front of this creature. These sensory organs will make the Acutomorphs and Tyrannoposauri even more effective predators. All of these adaptations will help our aliens conquer the deep sea during the events of the last 3 episodes. The deep sea is a very different beast to the surface ocean habitats. Most of the energy comes from surface ecosystems in the form of marine snow or dead organisms from the surface. The carcasses of fallen organisms may support large numbers of deep-sea creatures. On Earth, we call this type of event a whale fall, as it is typically observed and associated with whale carcasses. The other place where energy can enter this ecosystem is through hydrothermal vents. In these habitats, autotrophic organisms will use a chemical process called chemosynthesis, where the organism uses chemicals in their environment to make energy. Some clades might differ from their relatives in surface ocean habitats significantly, and others may be nearly identical. Today, however, we will be going over the more bizarre groups that almost exclusively reside in the deep sea. The deep ocean floor will be an interesting environment, populated mostly by bottom feeders and scavengers, like the Pisces and Polylamina. Both of these organisms are food for the trulomorphs in shallower waters, which means that a trulomorph clade may specialize to live here as well. In shallower areas, trulomorphs rely on sight, smell, and luck to find their prey. Since their sense of sight is practically rendered useless in these habitats, their transition to darker living conditions might entail some new sensory systems. On Earth, some organisms have specialized cells called electroreceptors. These cells are able to detect the tiny electrical signals released by living things. This new clade of trulomorphs might take millions of years to evolve these cells, so they may differ significantly from their relatives in shallower areas. For one, they may be the first group to gain a second dorsal fin to help them stabilize their movements. They may also change the positioning of their eyes to avoid them being damaged. Their eyes may also shrink significantly due to their limited use. Their coloring may change as a result in their change of scenery as well. It is beneficial for organisms to be darker colored down here, the same color as the abyss. These organisms may also gain an adaptation that is mirrored across many of the other deep-sea clades I mentioned in this episode. Deep-sea gigantism is a phenomenon seen in many groups on Earth, where creatures that live in deep water are larger than their shallow water cousins. Their large sizes can be attributed to two ecological rules, Bergmann's rule and Kleber's law. Bergmann's rule states that species living in colder climates will be larger than closely related species living in warmer climates. This is in part due to the square cube law introduced in the last episode. The law states that as something increases in volume, it has less surface area in proportion to that volume. So larger creatures will have less surface area to lose heat out of and more volume to make heat in. Kleber's law states that larger organisms are more efficient than smaller ones. An example of this is while a cat is 100 times larger than a mouse, it only consumes about 32 times the amount of energy that a mouse consumes. This is once again partially due to the square cube law. The larger creature's lower surface area to volume ratio allows them to waste less energy in the process of heat loss. Since the deep ocean floor is a little more resource scarce than shallower habitats, organisms residing here need to not only be efficient, but they also need to cover large distances in search of food. Being large helps with both of these problems, so our deep sea clade of trulomorphs may be noticeably larger than their relatives, with the largest members of this clade reaching well over 40 centimeters, almost 3 times the length of their predecessors, meaning that they likely can feed on prey that their ancestors never could. Before, Pellis lamina was much too large for the trulomorphs to eat, but with their newfound size, smaller species of Pellis lamina, and even the young of larger species, have been added to the menu. We will name this clade Marotrula, and although they may initially evolve much earlier, they will acquire their electroreceptive capabilities 1.885 billion years into the timeline. Speaking of Pellis lamina, they may be adapting to life in the abyss as well. The Thalassotesta at these depths are a lot more scarce than in shallower waters, so while some species of Pellis lamina may continue to be shell eaters at these depths, others may invade a new niche, prowling the vast ocean expanse in search of scraps that have fallen from the surface. Much of the energy that fuels the deep sea comes from the surface. Dead organisms, some microscopic and some not, fall to the ocean floor after they die. The death of microscopic organisms creates marine snow that is eaten by many of the species of Pisces lamina and Polylamina that populate the seabed. The deaths of larger organisms result in pieces or entire carcasses falling to the ocean floor. These scraps will fuel some scavenger niches in the abyss. The new Pellis lamina clade may once again be larger than their cousins closer to the surface. Their sensory hairs may elongate to help detect incoming predators, since their sight will be rendered next to useless down here. The distance between the entrance and the cavity used to absorb oxygen inside their breathing pores may be increased to allow the chemoreceptors lining the sides of this pathway to have a larger opportunity to pick up the faintest chemical signatures in the water. This adaptation will allow this clade to detect carcasses from great distances. They may gain some sharp, toothy structures on their arms to help process their food before passing it into their mouths. Their legs may elongate so they can take longer strides and get places faster. As a result of their large legs, we will call them altopods, and they will appear 1.86 billion years into the timeline. Let's talk about the Cyclops lamina. The Cyclops lamina went extinct in the shallows after the Osteichthyes evolved and took over their niche. However, they may have given rise to one new lineage in the deep before completely dying out. This lineage may evolve blood and swimming behaviors independently, but rather than having red blood like their relatives, the Osteichthyes, these organisms may have purple blood. On Earth, purple blood is found in peanut worms, duck leeches, and many other invertebrates. It is actually iron-based, just like our blood, but the compound that makes it all happen, hemerythrin, uses 2 iron ions to bond with oxygen, rather than just one, like us. These organisms' swimming behaviors may also be different from their Osteichthyes cousins. Instead of having a dedicated tail surface, these organisms may undulate the entire length of their body to generate forward force. This type of swimming is known as anguilliform swimming, and it applies pressure on the organism to be long and thin. This organism's eyes may also have never evolved a lens due to it living in a low-lit environment, so perhaps they evolved different ways of sensing their environment. They may retain the chemoreceptors on their backs that they inherited from the Pisces lamina long ago. They may also gain the ability to detect vibrations. Some area of their skin may evolve to be extra sensitive to movements in the water, allowing them to detect incoming predators. Their back may be lined with several creases, increasing surface area and therefore oxygen uptake through their respiration pores. When they undulate their body, these creases will be slightly opened and closed, creating an interesting active respiration method. They may also have some interesting reproduction habits, with all members of this clade retaining the ability to broadcast spawn, but they might mostly reproduce when they meet up at carcasses, with their sense of smell drawing them together where there is food, and their vibration sensors allowing them to locate their own kind. Once they have done this, both parents release their gametes into the water near each other, so the chances of the 2 gametes uniting is greatly increased. Their young then float about, filter feeding until they can swim on their own, after which they shed their combs and begin life as deep-sea scavengers. Their lack of jaw structure means that they will only be able to eat the very soft tissues, leaving the tougher stuff for other organisms. They will be called Dolichocyclops, and they will evolve 1.867 billion years into the timeline. Whale fall type events may constitute most of the energy that enters this ecosystem. However, there is another way. Hydrothermal vents are a geological phenomena where an opening in the seafloor spews hot, mineral-rich water into the surrounding environment. They can occur anywhere. However, they are most common in mid-ocean ridges, where tectonic plates are spreading apart and magma is just beneath the seafloor. These areas are typically pretty deep, so hydrothermal vents may be most common throughout the ecosystem that we're exploring today. So perhaps some deep-sea creatures specialize to get most of, if not all of their energy from hydrothermal vents. The vent ecosystem autotrophs are chemosynthetic, meaning they use chemicals released by the vent to power their metabolism. For now, these organisms will be bacteria-like, single-celled organisms that exist floating in the water or on the seafloor around hydrothermal vents. Obviously, these organisms will have their own set of microscopic predators, which I will not be covering in this episode. We will cover the microworld eventually, but today I will be focusing on the multicellular organisms that eat bacteria in the water and on the seafloor around these vents. Perhaps a clade of Dolichocyclops begins to exclusively live near these vents. One clade may specialize for eating the chemosynthetic bacteria off the seafloor, adapting their suction cup mouths to do the job. This clade will no longer have to travel long distances in search of food, so they may lose their swimming behaviors entirely, crawling across the ocean floor by flexing their underside. They may also evolve to be thinner, as their wide body shape won't benefit them much if they aren't swimming. Being thinner may also allow this organism to squeeze into burrows that it makes for itself by essentially eating dirt and then packing it into the walls when it comes out of the other end. But while they are in their burrow, they will need a way to breathe. So perhaps one of the gill-like surfaces from the old Dolichocyclops moves really far up to the front of this creature so it sticks out of the ground just slightly. Then, All this creature needs to do in order to breathe is bob their head up and down to open and close the fold. The adaptation to dig will be helpful because the vent ecosystem's temperature is very unstable, going from boiling hot to next to freezing in an instant. Because of this, perhaps digging isn't enough. On Earth, a few vent-dwelling organisms foster the growth of bacteria on their back to protect them from the elements. So maybe this new clade of Dolichocyclops evolves to do this as well, having a bacterial coat on their back to shield them from the harsh temperatures of the outside. We will call these strange vent dwellers Lepidovermi, and they will become the first creatures to reside exclusively near hydrothermal vents 1.871 billion years into the timeline. Reproduction will be a huge problem for these organisms to overcome. If they only mate with their local community, there won't be much genetic diversity. But in order to mate with members of their species in other colonies, they would have to travel across the vast expanse of the abyss with predators and potentially a lack of food threatening them all the way. Instead, these organisms may take the still risky but easier route of mating with their local group, their new young being the ones to spread the genetic diversity to other vent systems. Perhaps the juvenile form of these organisms remains plankton-like until they shed their combs and fall to the seafloor. It is extremely unlikely for their children to make it to a new vent, so they may produce millions of offspring in their lifetime, of which very few survive to maturity. This is an example of our selection, where an organism invests energy into having many offspring to increase their chances of surviving. These filter-feeding plankton larvae may allow these organisms to spread far and wide. In addition, perhaps they prompt the evolution of another worm-like vent dweller. Maybe a species of Leptovermi exhibits an instance of neoteny, where traits exhibited by younger members of a species are retained into maturity. Perhaps they keep their filter-feeding combs and adapt to a new lifestyle. After making their burrows, they may stay inside, poking their head out to filter-feed vent microbes floating around in the water. This clade may never leave the safety of their burrow unless their burrow itself becomes dangerous, or they need to mate. So perhaps these creatures only grow their protective jacket when they need to exit their burrow. We will call this clade Plumavermi, and they will appear shortly after their ancestors, 1.875 billion years into the timeline. The large quantity of floating microorganisms near hydrothermal vents may also attract the Thylacetesta. One clade may specialize to live exclusively near these vents. These creatures are sessile, meaning they lack the ability to move independently. So once they exit their free-floating larval stage and sink to the bottom of the ocean, they are unable to change their position. And since this new clade will rely on the vents for their favorite microorganisms, it may evolve to have their larval stage stay as plankton until they encounter a hydrothermal vent. Perhaps a chemical signature, or a change in the temperature of the water, triggers the larval stage of this creature to begin sinking to the bottom, entering a sort of hibernation until that happens. This method ensures that the ones that do survive the larval stage will be almost certainly surrounded by members of their own species. Having members of their own species in close proximity to them has the added benefit of making their method of broadcast spawning more efficient, as more gametes are likely to unite if they are closely together than if they were further apart. The boiling temperatures of the water around hydrothermal vents may pressure these creatures to make their own adaptations to deal with the heat. Perhaps these creatures evolve a shield out of their hard shell, facing the direction of the hot water. Their feeding arms may point in a more diagonal direction away from the shield, so that their shield doesn't impede on their ability to filter feed. We will name this clade Aspitesta, and they will cover the vent ecosystem 1.863 billion years into the timeline. Since the Pellis lamina feed on the Thylacetesta, they may follow suit and gain a representative that lives near hydrothermal vents, once again specializing to live nearly their entire lives around these vents. Perhaps this clade takes a similar approach to protecting themselves from the environment to the Plumavermi and the Leptovermi, coating themselves in a bacteria-like organism to insulate them from their environment. Perhaps the hairs that were originally used for detecting vibrations in the water help facilitate growth of their bacterial symbiote much better than just plain skin. As a result of this, perhaps the hairs begin growing all over the body, helping the growth of the bacteria. The bacteria growing on this clade may take on several different colors, as the chemosynthetic bacteria on Earth takes on many different colors as well. Their new adaptation may be extremely beneficial while foraging for food. However, when the time comes to reproduce, they may be faced with some challenges. The hairs on their backs will prevent their partner's gametes from reaching their reproductive surfaces. Not only that, but the children will need to be dispersed to other colonies in order to have enough genetic diversity for the species to continue existing. The issue with their reproductive behaviors can be solved by these creatures shedding their hairs in that area before mating. This will leave them vulnerable to the extreme temperatures for as long as their young are developing. So perhaps these organisms evolved to have their children attached to their parents for a very short period of time, allowing the parent to release their children and regrow their hairs with the hope of reproducing again at some point. So this organism will essentially re-evolve the larval dispersal method possessed by their ancestors millions of years ago. Perhaps these larvae lack legs, instead having several nubs that they can beat back and forth for very limited motion. The only place they may have hairs may be on the arms. Their method of survival will essentially be deep-sea filter feeders, using their hairy arms to collect microscopic food slowly over time. Eventually, they will get larger and begin to grow legs. Once the larva reaches their maximum size, they might stay in this larval form for some time, perhaps in a similar vein to the Aspitesta larvae. A chemical signature in the water signals this organism's larvae to fall to the seafloor. They won't be able to eat the Aspitesta right away, as they are too small when they first enter the juvenile stage, and they still lack hairs on much of their body. So perhaps they just eat young plumavermi and leptovermi, occasionally incorporating microorganisms on the seafloor into their diet. Eventually, they will reach the adult stage, where they are large enough to eat all of the vent ecosystem organisms, and their whole body is covered in bacteria-covered hairs. This interesting 4-stage life cycle will allow this clade's young to disperse throughout much of the ocean, with the added benefit of preventing competition between younger and older members of the same species. Let's call them Thyrotrichi. They will appear in the vent ecosystem 1.865 billion years into the timeline. One of the most intriguing things to note about the vents is that they can support life no matter the condition of the surface. So the vent ecosystem, and all of the organisms that get 100% of their energy from deep-sea vents, can exist on the dark side of our tidally locked world. Far below the sheets of ice and fed by the planet itself, representatives of these clades may be the only widely successful multicellular groups of the Midnight Zone. The vast expanse of the deep sea on the light side of the planet may serve as a playground for some apex predators. They may not only scavenge for food falling from the surface, but also feed on living organisms in that habitat. Perhaps a clade of Loricatrum stoma is the first to adapt to this niche. Coming from surface habitats, this clade will once again experience deep-sea gigantism, with even the smallest members of this clade growing larger than the largest members of their reef-dwelling relatives. Their lateral ring system will help them find their way around in the depths, along with their sense of smell and taste located inside of their mouth. These creatures will spend much of their time looking for scraps from the surface and eat organisms that gather around those scraps, along with the scraps themselves. Due to the fact that, for the most part, this creature cannot see anything, they may not know the exact location of their prey until they detect it with their lateral line system. Most of the time, these prey items will not be directly in front of this creature, meaning that they will have to turn rapidly to eat their prey. This may select for a more and more flexible body, meaning more and more segments. This clade may have the most segmented body out of any of their armored cousins, with the most segments in their neck region, giving them a large range of motion in that area. For this reason, we will name them Arthrocolus. Arthrocolus will need to undergo a few more specializations to the deep sea. Coloring is one of them. As touched on earlier in the episode, red light is absorbed by water very quickly. And even on Earth, deep sea creatures evolved to be very sensitive to blue light, nearly ignoring wavelengths that get absorbed by water more easily. This is why many deep sea creatures, and just sea creatures in general, take on red colors as opposed to black or gray. Because when red light is absent, red-colored objects are effectively black. Another adaptation that this creature may gain is a dorsal spike. Common in many bottom dwellers on Earth, this spike will help protect them from attacks coming from above. The predators of this clade will include Morsdontia as well as the Tyrannopassari as soon as they come along. The Arthrocolus will come onto the scene 1.881 billion years into the timeline. In the deep sea, one of the most prevalent challenges is finding a mate. It is next to impossible to see in this habitat, so a potential mate could come within 100 meters of a creature, and they might not have any idea. As mentioned previously, different creatures have different ways of dealing with this problem. From meeting at food sources, to just blindly running into each other with the help of scent. But what if they could see each other? This would increase the likelihood of finding a mate significantly. Luckily, there is a way that they could broadcast their position visually. On Earth, some creatures can create light using chemical reactions in their body. This process, known as bioluminescence, has evolved independently over 40 times on Earth that we know of. So perhaps a few clades of creatures on Nusku evolve it as well. Maybe a clade of Dolichocyclops becomes the first clade to develop bioluminescence. Their current method of finding a mate entails them meeting at different sources of food. This is dangerous, however, because their predators can find them at these sources of food. So if these creatures could find each other and mate away from their predators, they'll have a higher reproductive success. Perhaps their new method of finding a mate entails them lighting up 2 strips that contain bioluminescent chemicals on their back. Bioluminescence can come in a wide variety of colors, but ocean creatures' bioluminescence are almost always blue. There are obviously exceptions to this, but it makes sense that blue bioluminescence might be more prominent because, once again, blue light travels further in water than other wavelengths, and bioluminescence is almost always meant to be seen by other creatures. So this new clade of Dolichocyclops may have blue bioluminescence. It would obviously be a huge waste if these organisms were lit up all the time, as not only would they be constantly broadcasting their location to potential predators, they would also be wasting a lot of energy as well. So these creatures may only occasionally blink when they are looking for a mate, staying dark the rest of the time. This clade may also evolve a lens to be able to see better, as it is actually beneficial now. However, perhaps these creatures can only see the colors that are relevant to them, meaning that they will almost exclusively see in blue wavelengths. We will name this bioluminescent clade Latus Cyclops, and they will appear 1.872 billion years into the timeline. Bioluminescence is not only used to find mates, it has several other uses as well. One of the most renowned examples is in predation. On Earth, the anglerfish is one of the most recognizable fish of the deep sea. It uses a bioluminescent bacteria to light up a fleshy bulb which it dangles in front of its face. Prey items come to investigate the glowing orb, only to find themselves centimeters from death. Perhaps a clade of Arthrocolus becomes the second clade on Nusku to evolve bioluminescence. However, this clade may not do it in the same way as the Latus Cyclops. The Latus Cyclops perform the chemical reactions required for bioluminescence themselves. Maybe this new clade has another organism do it for them. All Loricatramstoma descendants have gas pockets embedded within their armor. This allows these creatures to counteract some of the weight of their armor with buoyancy. Maybe this clade fills some of its air pockets with a bioluminescent microorganism, forming a symbiotic relationship. A symbiotic relationship is a relationship between two species where both species benefit. This is a type of biotic relationship seen over many different kingdoms of life on Earth. It is also a widespread phenomenon on Nusku. For instance, the bacteria-like organisms near hydrothermal vents formed a symbiotic relationship with the leptovermi, plumovermi, and thyrotrichi. The creatures benefit from the blanket of safety provided by their bacterial coat, and the bacteria-like aliens benefit by getting a free ride between areas with high chemical nutrient content in the water. In this new example, the bioluminescent organisms benefit by being protected from predators and the elements while inside the Arthrocolus, and the Arthrocolus descendants benefit from the light supplied by the bioluminescent organisms that they use to hunt. Since most of the creatures populating Nuskuan oceans at this time are pretty dumb, these organisms will experience great success with their bioluminescent lure. This clade will have several distinctly different species that have different numbers of bioluminescent pockets in different places, but they will all have one large one that sits just behind their jaw on its top side. We will name these deep water demons Latostoma, and their reign of terror on small deep-sea creatures will begin 1.888 billion years into the timeline. Now we return to a broader view of the Nuskuan biosphere to discuss a topic that is very relevant to the next few million years of this planet's history: illness. Today, we will be discussing illnesses that are caused by things unrelated to the organisms themselves. Ailments caused by malfunctions within a creature's biology deserve a video of their own. I will break down the diseases covered in this episode into 3 general categories. The first category is one that I'm sure that we are all very familiar with by now: viruses. Although widely not considered to be truly alive, viruses are the most abundant biological entities on Earth, with an estimated 10 to the 31st power of them. They also come in many shapes and sizes. Scientists generally agree that they have coexisted with cellular life since the beginning. Some theories even suggest that they might have been here first. But the general consensus seems to be that the origin of viruses on Earth is somehow tied to the origin of life. So perhaps Nusku has viruses, or something that very closely resembles viruses. This is a fact that will likely hold true for all of the life-bearing planets in the Rosea system. The second category contains living microscopic organisms, basically single-cellular or colonial life forms that cause disease. We will circle back to this category later, as it will play a vital role in shaping a clade that is very important to the future of this planet. The third and final category we are going to discuss are parasites. While all disease-causing organisms could be classified as parasitic, where one organism benefits at the expense of another, the parasitic category will only refer to parasitic multicellular organisms. There are obviously exceptions, but this is how we will generalize the ailment-causing organisms on Nusku. Now, let's talk about some parasitic clades. Perhaps the earliest example of parasitism on Nusku came from a clade of Pisces lamina. The Pisces lamina are an incredibly diverse clade with many living and dead representatives. Their gigantic diversity could also be an entire video on its own. So today we will only look at this clade, not its full ancestry. These creatures will evolve to live within the bodies of various Propungus species, living nearly their entire lives inside of them, feeding on the nutrient-rich tissues within. They may create massive burrows inside. The organisms may only leave the safety of these burrows once in their entire lives, to mate. Remember, the earliest Pisces lamina used a method of reproduction called broadcast spawning, where the organism releases many gametes into the water and only a few unite to create new individuals. Releasing the gametes while still inside of their burrows will decrease their likelihood of reproductive success, so they may find their way to the outside of their burrow and release their gametes there before heading back inside. They may detect whether they are outside of their burrow with a set of light-sensitive cells that cover their top side. This clade may have inherited a single tooth-like structure inside of each mouth that it got from a specific radiation of Pisces lamina that it evolved from. This clade may take a thinner profile in order to move through their burrows more easily. Although this clade may first only infest Propungus species, they may later spread on to gain representatives that burrow into the flesh of motile creatures. We will name this clade Acutostoma, and they will begin living inside of the various Propungus very early in the history of multicellular life on this planet, 1.835 billion years into the timeline. Perhaps a clade of Thylacetesta becomes parasitic as well. Once again, the Thylacetesta are an extremely diverse group of organisms. Their shells come in many different shapes, sizes, and even colors. I depict them as white in these videos, but they can be anything from blacks to browns to whites, and even combinations of the three. This parasitic clade may have descended from a shorter radiation of Thylacetesta. It might have specialized for living attached to motile creatures, and so being shorter reduces their chance of being removed. Perhaps this selective pressure is increased once the Pisces rostro evolve. Certain species of Pisces rostro may have evolved to eat the Thylacetesta off of other organisms. Perhaps the Thylacetesta evolved to counteract this by not only gaining a more potent glue, but also evolving to dig a part of their shell into the creature that they are living on. Perhaps over several million years, the Thylacetesta embed much of their body into the creature that they are living on. This change of location on their host may coincide with another adaptation. Although the Thalassetesta mostly use the respiration pores at the opening of their shell, they have more pores covering their body that they use during the larval stage of development. Now that this creature is exposed to the oxygen and nutrient-rich blood inside of their host, they may begin to use their pores not only to absorb oxygen, but also to absorb nutrients. This means that the shells of these creatures can close completely, with only a tiny hole left over to expel waste. They will retain their mouths and feeding feathers during the larval stage, shedding their feathers and having their mouths become completely covered by their shell as soon as they become dependent on the nutrient supply from their host. By this point, these parasites may have evolved to live so deep inside of their host that the only part of their body that sticks out is the tiny hole that releases waste. We will call these bizarre parasites Dermatesta, and they will begin their infestation of Nusku 1.892 billion years into the timeline. Obviously, there will be many more Nuskuan parasites than just these, but this should give you a general understanding of the state of parasitism on Nusku. Now let's circle back to the second disease category, and talk about a very specific infection's impact on evolution. Perhaps a species of microorganism has taken a particular fondness for consuming calcium-based structures and the organic material that they encase. Over many million years, this disease has jumped between a few different species and now threatens a specific species of Tyrannosauri. This group is especially vulnerable to this disease because of their bones. The antibodies that make up their immune systems are located within the blood, just like creatures on Earth. So how does an organism get the antibodies located in their bloodstream to areas deep within their bones? Perhaps they gain a series of tiny channels that allow blood to diffuse deep within their bones. This way, antibodies can protect those areas without significantly affecting the structure of the skeleton. They might also cover their beak and skin so it isn't exposed to the elements, with only their serrations remaining exposed to the outside world. Perhaps after a few million years, this single Tyrannosauri species gives rise to an entirely new clade. Maybe this clade extends the channels of their bones throughout much of their body, making this clade the first to have a closed circulatory system. A closed circulatory system is a series of channels that more efficiently transports blood to all areas of the body. This new adaptation will have the added benefit of allowing them to be more active for much longer than their predecessors, making them even better hunters than before. These creatures now find themselves in a world where they are the most advanced by far. Their closed circulatory system is going to give them a huge advantage moving forward. This clade will be named Novapsari, and it will appear on Nusku 1.91 billion years into the timeline. Another group of organisms that has likely suffered for a long time from disease are the asexually reproducing Propungus species. Asexual reproduction is a great way to rapidly and reliably populate an area, but it results in the population having a low genetic diversity. Something important to note, however, is that asexually reproducing creatures are not perfect clones. They do have a small amount of genetic diversity because of the mutation caused by errors in cell replication or by solar radiation exposure. Populations with lower genetic diversity have a higher susceptibility to being completely wiped out by a disease. A disease that can get through one individual's immune system will not have much trouble getting through the others, as they are nearly identical. As we saw in the last episode, a clade of Propungus evolves sexual reproduction on their way to land. Perhaps an early radiation of this clade remains in the water, having already completely evolved sexual reproduction. They will have a much higher amount of genetic variation, and thus, much more success. However, this clade will be slightly different from their more derived land-dwelling cousins. For one, they will be a bit shorter to avoid being swept away by the sea. They will have the ability to replace their leaves just like their land cousins, but they will have less of them, making their canopy less dense. These organisms won't have seeds, but instead using spores to disperse their fertilized young. And finally, they will lack microscopic hooks on their leaves that the more derived Pterophyla groups use to catch gametes, instead having a simple rough surface. This early radiation of Pterophyla we will name Proto-Pterophyla. They will emerge just before their land cousins fully evolve, 1.897 billion years into the timeline. So far, the only clade that has no surviving species left are the Cyclops lamina. However, with the advent of new and much more advanced clades, along with some environmental factors, many organisms may find it extremely difficult to compete. The first Nuskuan mass extinction will truly mark the end of an era in Nusku's natural history, and it will shape which creatures come out of it as major players during the next era. We will call this event the Proto-Nuskuan Extinction, and it will come in two distinct waves, lasting a total of nearly 40 million years. The first wave of extinctions may be kicked off by the evolution of sexual reproduction in the Proto-Pterophyla. The asexual Propungus may have been struggling for some time before sexual species appear. Sexual reproduction may be the final nail in the coffin for primitive Propungus groups. Every single asexual species may be completely extinct just 8 million years after the Proto-Pterophyla first evolve. The second wave of extinctions may begin after the evolution of the true Pterophyla. The first ever land Propungus may prompt a series of changes in the environment that upsets the balance in the ecosystem. The root-like systems of these organisms may slowly break up the rocks over time, releasing minerals into the ecosystem that weren't previously available. The result of this may be an explosion of photosynthetic organisms that require minerals like phosphorus to survive. At first thought, this might sound like a good thing for the ecosystem, but this is not necessarily true. After these organisms die, they are broken down by bacteria-like organisms. This process uses up a lot of oxygen, resulting in more oxygen being lost than produced by the photosynthesizers. The dropping oxygen levels will certainly have an astounding impact on the Nuskuan flora and fauna, but it will also affect the climate. Oceans with less oxygen trap carbon much better than oceans with more oxygen. Less carbon means less carbon dioxide, and less carbon dioxide means a generally cooler climate. So the simple addition of plants on land caused a massive change in the environment, with a rapid drop in oxygen levels and a more gradual drop in planet-wide temperature that may take over 30 million years to stabilize. This second wave will be the hardest hitting and longest lasting wave. Its effects will extend past the extinction and play an important role in the beginning of the next era. Obviously, many creatures are going to meet their end, or have to heavily adapt to survive. All of the clades will have extinct species within them, but many clades will see their complete elimination, allowing the survivors to diversify and take their place. The next era in the sea will be dominated by these surviving clades. Let's take a look at the key players. Obviously, Proto-Pterophyla will fare extremely well, essentially having a monopoly on the seafloor as soon as they outcompete all of their asexually reproducing cousins. The Maro-Trula have a very unique advantage that no other creatures possess. Their electroreceptors give them a huge advantage while hunting in the dark, but after niches closer to the surface start opening up, species of this clade may have a very easy time filling them. The Novapessari's circulatory system may allow them to be major players as well. Not only does it allow them to be more active, it also allows them to be more oxygen efficient, which is good in the now oxygen-poor oceans. The Pelus lamina are a very generalist and adaptable clade of creatures, making them a good candidate for surviving the extinction. There are obviously several other surviving clades, but these are just the major players that will dominate the next era in Nuskuan history. We will go into depth about the ocean ecosystem's recovery in a future episode. Naming and documenting every species on this alien world would be impossible, and would completely halt the progress of this project. So the clades outlined today should be taken as a general representation of the Nuskuan flora and fauna. In the next episode, we return to land and explore the extent of the Pterophyla's diversity, along with their first ever motile company. Thank you all for watching. I would just like to take a moment to thank everyone who has made art for this episode. You all really help improve the quality of these videos and significantly impact the rate at which I am able to make them. If you would like to make art for a video, talk with the community, or just know the progress of the next video, you should join our Discord. Link in the description.